Ever had to stand up to someone everyone else feared?
My mom told me not to ruin my brother's engagement party. And I didn't. His fiancée did. Right in front of 80 guests, two champagne towers, and one very confused golden retriever who seemed more emotionally prepared for the evening than any of us. Now, I know what you're thinking. What could possibly make a woman stand up in heels that cost more than my car payment and announce, in front of half the state of Georgia, that her diamond ring didn't mean what we thought it did? And why did I, the older sister, just sit there and sip my drink like I'd seen it all before? Well, I had. Not this exact scene, sure, but I'd lived through enough carefully staged family disasters to know when a bomb was about to go off, and this one had been ticking for weeks. Maybe months. And the worst part? I could have stopped it. I could have said something. I could have taken Ethan aside, just once, and told him to slow down, to ask more questions, to pay attention to the way Jenna's smile never quite reached her eyes when he talked about forever. But I didn't. Because when someone begs you, practically in tears, to let their one perfect moment happen, even if it's all smoke and mirrors, sometimes you give them that. And sometimes that silence becomes its own kind of betrayal. The party was held at our parents' house, which they'd turned into a Pinterest nightmare of soft lights, white roses, champagne buckets, and enough rustic elegance to make Joanna Gaines weep with joy. My mom, Linda, had been planning it for weeks, maybe months. She was glowing with pride, the way only a Southern mother can when one of her children is finally doing what she's been praying for since they were old enough to hold hands in Sunday school. Ethan, the baby of the family by 5 years, had always been her soft spot, the golden boy with the gentle eyes and the constant need to make everyone happy. He'd grown up under a different roof than I did, not literally, but in every other way that counts. By the time he was born, Dad had softened, Mom had aged into her martyr role, and I had already learned to take care of myself. Ethan got lullabies. I got lectures. So when I pulled up to the driveway that evening and saw the crowd of guests, old neighbors, church friends, a few former teachers, people who barely knew Ethan but adored Linda, I knew immediately that this party wasn't just for him. It was a showcase. A polished, glimmering, three-tiered proof that the Green family was whole, successful, and full of happy endings. And all I had to do, according to Mom, was not screw it up. She'd called me that morning, early enough to know she was nervous. "Rachel," she'd said, with that slightly breathless tone she used when she was trying not to accuse me of anything, "please don't overshadow him tonight. Just let Ethan have this one, okay? He deserves it." I wanted to laugh. Overshadow? I hadn't even updated my LinkedIn profile in 3 years, and the last time I posted a photo of myself, I was wearing sweatpants and holding a burrito like it was a trophy. But to Mom, I would always be the one who made too much money, asked too many questions, and refused to play along. The one who didn't get married, who moved out of state, who came home with sharp opinions and short patience. The one who didn't cry during Hallmark movies and didn't believe in fairy tales. So, fine. I promised her. I told her I'd smile, clap, and stay in the background. And I kept my word. I really did. I wore the navy dress she liked, smiled for the photos, even held Jenna's hand when she showed off the ring for the 100th time. Jenna was stunning, like one of those lifestyle influencers who somehow never sweat. Blonde waves, flawless teeth, the kind of Southern charm that could slice you open without leaving a mark. Ethan looked at her like he'd found the last good woman on earth, and she looked at him like he was a decent prop. That's what I saw. And I'm not proud to say I didn't warn him. Because I knew. I saw it before he did. And maybe that's why I stayed silent. Dinner was served on the lawn, long tables draped in ivory linen, candles flickering like a wedding already half begun. The speeches started shortly after dessert. Mom went first, of course, with her voice cracking just enough to be touching, but not messy. Then Dad mumbled something about God's timing. Then Ethan stood, cheeks flushed with joy, and talked about how he knew Jenna was the one from the moment he saw her rescue a stray cat in the church parking lot. Lies, of course. Ethan's never even been to church on a weekday. But that's how these stories go. And then, just as the quartet started playing again and waiters began passing out champagne for the final toast, Jenna rose. She didn't clink a glass or clear her throat. She just stood there, straight-backed and calm, and raised her flute like it was a weapon. The room, or rather, the lawn, hushed itself, like it somehow sensed what was coming. "This ring," she said, her voice steady and louder than you'd expect from someone so delicate-looking, "doesn't mean what you think it does." There was no gasp, no dramatic reaction, just a wall of stunned silence as 80 people collectively held their breath. My heart started hammering so hard I thought someone might hear it, and I had the strangest urge to laugh, just to break the tension. She continued, "Ethan, you are the kindest man I've ever met. And you deserve honesty. You deserve the truth. But not all truths are simple, and not all of them belong in private." She turned slightly then, her eyes landing on me with such precision that I suddenly felt like the main character in a story I didn't even know I was part of. I could feel my mother's eyes on me, sharp, questioning, terrified, but I didn't move. I didn't flinch. Because something in Jenna's face told me that whatever came next wasn't just about Ethan. It was about me. About what I'd done. Or hadn't done. And then she said the sentence that would shatter the whole night like a wine glass dropped on marble. "Ask Rachel." No drama. No tears. Just those 2 words. I took a long sip of champagne. I smiled. And I waited. 2 months before the party that would fracture our family in a way no one would openly admit, but everyone would quietly carry, I met Jenna Caldwell for the very first time, and although I smiled and shook her hand like any polite older sister might, something in my gut twisted so hard I felt it days later, a subtle, sharp warning, the kind that doesn't speak in words, but in shadows, in moments where a voice in the back of your head whispers, "She's not who she says she is," and you ignore it. Because the truth would be too inconvenient to face, too uncomfortable to say out loud, especially when your mother is sitting next to you gripping your thigh just a little too tightly under the table and mouthing "be nice" while pretending to sip her mimosa. It was a Sunday brunch, the kind of thing Linda insisted on whenever she wanted to size someone up without making it look like an interview. Held at a local bistro in downtown Marietta, where every dish had truffle oil and every server looked like they were secretly auditioning for something bigger. Jenna arrived 10 minutes early, which was already a red flag, dressed in a white sundress that practically screamed "I'm harmless," and yet somehow I felt like I'd just stepped into a courtroom without realizing I was on trial. She was warm, polite, beautiful in that polished, almost strategic way, her makeup perfect but not obvious, her compliments generous but not overdone, her answers just detailed enough to suggest authenticity without giving anything away. She mentioned her work in nonprofit fundraising, her love for golden retrievers, and how she'd known Ethan for just a few months, but had already never felt more understood. I remember glancing at Ethan then, who sat beside her, beaming like a kid showing off a science project, and thinking to myself that he'd always been drawn to people who smiled too much, as if that alone proved sincerity. But what caught me off guard, what flipped a quiet switch in my memory I hadn't touched in years, was a thin gold bracelet Jenna wore on her left wrist, delicate, understated, with a small emerald charm that spun slowly every time she reached for her water glass. It was the exact bracelet I had seen 4 years ago on a night I've never fully spoken about, not to Ethan, not to my mother, not even to the friends who watched me unravel slowly and with quiet efficiency after my relationship with Todd ended. A bracelet that once sat on his nightstand, next to the dog-eared copy of East of Eden he claimed was his favorite book but had never actually read. I knew that bracelet. And I knew, in that moment, that Jenna had once belonged somewhere she had no business being. I didn't say anything that day. I made polite conversation, laughed at all the right moments, and only tightened my grip on my champagne flute when Jenna mentioned how Ethan had a rare heart, and how she'd never met a man so pure. I excused myself early, claimed work obligations, and sat in my car for 10 full minutes staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to decide whether I was angry, jealous, suspicious, or just tired of pretending that family obligations were more important than gut instinct. I didn't tell Ethan what I saw. I didn't confront Jenna. I went home, opened a bottle of cheap red wine, and reminded myself that people don't always want to be saved. Some want the fantasy, even if it's cracked down the middle. But as the days passed, my silence started to sour into something uglier. I started noticing things: the way Jenna would pause before talking about her past, the way Ethan never mentioned how they met, the way Todd, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year, suddenly started popping up again in mutual circles, as if the universe was trying to tug on a thread I'd worked hard to bury. One night, I scrolled through social media and saw a tagged photo, blurry, taken at a rooftop bar, but unmistakable. Jenna, Todd, together. Not close enough to scream scandal, but not far enough apart to suggest innocence either. I stared at it until my phone battery died. I knew I couldn't sit on it forever. I knew Ethan deserved to know. But every time I rehearsed the conversation in my head, it ended the same way, with Ethan's voice breaking, with my mother blaming me for meddling, with everyone pretending that my motivations were rooted in bitterness and not truth. So I waited. I watched. I kept hoping Jenna would do what women like her rarely do, walk away quietly and spare the mess. She didn't. A week before the party, I saw her again, by accident or maybe not, walking out of Todd's condo building in the middle of the afternoon, wearing sunglasses and a ponytail like she was trying not to be seen, though not hard enough for it to be a real effort. I didn't confront her. I didn't even get out of my car. I just watched her get into her spotless white SUV, watched her check her lipstick in the mirror, and watched her drive away like she hadn't just detonated something that had been fragile and half-broken for years. That night, I called her. I don't know what I expected. Maybe denial. Maybe a lie. Maybe some half-baked excuse about old friends and chance encounters. What I got was silence. And then, finally, a voice that didn't sound sorry at all, just calm, composed, and scarily direct. "I'm doing this for him," Jenna said. "And for you." Then she hung up. I stared at the phone, half expecting it to ring again, but it didn't. And I sat there in the dark, wine in hand, wondering what the hell she meant. Doing what for me? Ruining my brother's life? Unraveling a story that had barely started? Or maybe, just maybe, she meant something far worse, that by standing quietly beside her while knowing what I knew, I had already given her permission. That the toast she was planning wasn't just a betrayal. It was a performance. One she knew I wouldn't interrupt. And she was right. There's a moment, just a split second, really, when you know the center cannot hold, when the social fabric, the smiles, the shared glances and careful performances all come undone. And what's left isn't a scene or a scandal, but something quieter and infinitely more violent. Silence, thick and accusing, that wraps itself around every person in the room and demands they choose between pretending and believing. That was the exact moment Jenna said, with the calm of a surgeon and the grace of a pageant queen, "Ask Rachel," and placed her glass back on the table without spilling a drop. It didn't matter what she meant. Not yet. The words themselves, hanging in the humid Georgia air, were enough to shatter the evening like a crystal vase dropped from the balcony. At first, no one moved. It was as if we'd all been frozen mid-breath, mid-sip, mid-smile, stuck between the polite illusion we'd clung to for 2 hours and the truth that was suddenly, undeniably, hovering just above our heads like a thundercloud with perfect posture. Ethan was the first to stir, not dramatically, not with rage or accusation, but with this slow, almost childlike confusion, the kind that hurts more than anger ever could, as he turned toward me with eyes so wide and glassy I thought, for one unbearable second, he might actually cry in front of everyone. That was when I knew this moment, this precise breaking point, would brand itself into all of us, not just him, not just me, but every guest who had shown up in pastel linen and cocktail dresses to witness what was supposed to be a celebration, and had instead stumbled into a war zone disguised as a toast. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. His face asked every question at once, and none of them were the right one. He wanted to know what Jenna meant, of course, and whether I had any idea what she was talking about, and whether I was somehow involved in whatever mess had just been implied, but what he really wanted, what he truly, desperately needed, was for me to shake my head and say no, to laugh and tell him Jenna was being dramatic, to wrap the illusion around him one more time, so he didn't have to look directly into the storm. And for the briefest of moments, I almost did. But I couldn't. Not because I suddenly found the courage to be honest, not because I believed he deserved the truth in that particular moment, but because I realized something far worse, that I had waited too long, let the rot go too deep, and now, no matter what I said or how I said it, I had already become part of the lie. Around us, the party began to shift in texture, the laughter stopped entirely, the string quartet stumbled into silence, and the conversations dissolved into a thick soup of whispers and darting glances. People clutched their drinks tighter, leaned into each other with raised brows, and looked at Ethan the way people look at someone they pity but don't want to touch. My mother, ever the master of forced composure, stood stiffly beside my father with her jaw clenched so tight I thought her molars might crack, and in her eyes was something that wasn't fear, but something more damning, control slipping through her fingers. She wasn't just worried about Ethan's heart. She was watching the carefully constructed image of her family, all the Sunday mornings and engagement photos and homemade casseroles, flicker and tear at the seams. Jenna, for her part, looked calm. Not smug, not vindicated, but unnervingly serene, like a woman who had already mourned the wreckage and was now simply watching the demolition play out as expected. She didn't look at me again, not once, and that silence between us spoke louder than anything either of us could have said. It wasn't hate. It wasn't even spite. It was something colder, certainty. I reached for my glass, not because I needed a drink, but because my hands needed something to do before they betrayed me, and took a long, deliberate sip while I stared straight ahead, willing the earth to swallow me whole or, at the very least, transport me to a timeline where I had made different choices. I thought maybe someone else would speak first, that mom would interrupt, that dad would chuckle awkwardly and change the subject, that a waiter would drop a tray or a dog would bark, but nothing came to save us. The only sound was the clinking of Jenna's glass being set down, and the unspoken expectation that I would now explain myself. So I did what I've always done in situations where honesty is both too dangerous and too late. I deflected. I smiled. Well, I said, lifting my glass slightly in the air, this party just got interesting. A few nervous laughs scattered through the tables, the kind that don't come from humor, but from panic, from people desperately trying to restore order with politeness. But Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He just kept staring at me like he was seeing someone he didn't recognize, like I'd peeled off my skin and revealed something unforgivable underneath. And that's when it hit me, he thought I had done this. That I had planned it. That Jenna's words were a coordinated ambush and that I was the archer behind the curtain. It was in his posture, his clenched fists, the way he took a single step back from the table as though the physical space might protect him from whatever was unraveling. I wanted to tell him the truth, to say I hadn't asked for this moment, that I hadn't orchestrated the drama, that I had tried, in my own broken way, to shield him from it. But again, the damage was already done. I had let the match burn in my hand until it reached the skin, and now the fire wasn't just lit, it was roaring. Jenna turned and walked away, not toward Ethan, not toward me, but toward the side path that led back into the house. People watched her go with the kind of awe usually reserved for train wrecks and confessions. She didn't flinch. She didn't stumble. She walked like a woman who knew exactly what she had done and had no intention of apologizing for any of it. Ethan stood for a moment longer, then pushed back from the table and followed her, not running, not yelling, just walking, like a man heading toward the gallows. The path between them was quiet and terrible. I stayed in my seat. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs were lead, and my chest was too tight to speak. Around me, the buzz of conversation began to rise again, this time sharper, more urgent, voices turning from curious to cruel. My mother leaned over and whispered, "Fix this." But she didn't understand what had just happened. This wasn't a scandal. This wasn't a mess to be cleaned up with apologies and family meetings. This was a reckoning. And Jenna hadn't lit the match, she'd simply dropped it. I had handed her the gasoline. The treehouse was still there, tilted slightly with age and softened around the edges by years of rain and Georgia sun, but somehow it remained stubbornly intact, suspended between the branches like a memory too proud to collapse. A place Ethan still escaped to when things felt too loud or too crowded or too sharp, which is exactly where I found him that night, crouched awkwardly inside the same wooden shell he'd loved since we were kids, as though it could shield him from the wreckage he hadn't seen coming but somehow sensed had been circling him for weeks. The whole backyard, once so carefully staged with fairy lights and tulle and champagne optimism, now looked like the aftermath of a cancelled parade, folding chairs slightly askew, platters abandoned half-eaten. Candles still flickering like they hadn't received the memo that the celebration was over and the fantasy had been quietly buried under broken glass and unanswered questions. I didn't call his name, didn't knock or announce myself, just climbed up the familiar wooden steps one slow foot after the other, careful not to break the silence that had settled between us like a fog. He didn't look up right away. He sat hunched on the wooden bench, elbows resting on his knees, head in his hands, and when he finally did glance at me, it wasn't with anger or accusation or even confusion. It was something worse, something far heavier. Something that felt like quiet betrayal wrapped in disappointment, and in that moment I realized that whatever remained between us, sibling loyalty, unspoken memories, the kind of love that only people who share childhoods can understand, was now cracked in places I couldn't reach and maybe didn't deserve to. "You knew," he said, not loudly, not with any real demand behind it, just the soft weight of a man who'd come to the conclusion on his own and only needed me to confirm it so he could stop holding on to the hope that he might be wrong. There was no point in pretending anymore, not after Jenna had thrown my name into the fire like a spark meant to ignite everything, and I suppose part of me was almost relieved to finally stop hiding behind restraint and guilt. So I nodded. Not dramatically. Just enough. He didn't ask how long I'd known or why I hadn't said anything, not yet anyway. We sat in silence for a minute or two, the kind of silence that stretches between people who know each other too well to fill the space with small talk. And then he whispered, almost to himself, "Was it him?" I didn't answer right away, mostly because I didn't want to see his face when he heard the truth, and partly because I wasn't sure how to explain the kind of history that existed between me and Todd, not the timeline, not the details, but the texture of it. The way it had once mattered more than anything and then, in the quietest, cruelest way possible, had simply stopped being real when he vanished without a word, leaving behind a hollow ache and a few scattered clues I was too proud to chase. Eventually, I nodded again. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a sound that felt too calm for what he'd just heard, and he leaned back against the wall of the treehouse, staring at the low-hanging branches as though they held some kind of answer. "I thought she loved me," he said finally, not accusing me, not even blaming her, just stating it, like a fact he couldn't quite believe had been wrong all along. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I too had once thought I mattered to someone who didn't deserve the space he took up in my heart, that I had spent too many nights trying to piece together a man who turned out to be more hollow than human. But instead, I just said, "You weren't the only one." He looked at me then, eyes narrowing just slightly. "So this was about revenge?" he asked, his voice not angry but wounded in that way that makes you feel like a villain in a story you never meant to be part of. I shook my head, but even that felt dishonest, because while I hadn't orchestrated any of this, hadn't pushed Jenna toward confession or sabotage, I also hadn't stopped it. I had watched it unfold with the quiet relief of someone who has been holding a heavy truth for far too long and finally sees someone else willing to drop it in plain sight. It was about surviving, I said, choosing each word with care, because I was tired of being the one who swallowed things so everyone else could keep smiling. He turned away again, and for a long time we didn't speak. I could feel the night air shift, cooler now, pressing against us like a reminder that time was still moving, even if everything else had stopped. Finally, he asked, "Why didn't you just tell me?" I thought about that question, not just for the moment, but for all the times I could have answered it and didn't. The brunch where Jenna's bracelet had caught the light just wrong, the photo I'd seen online of her and Todd too close for coincidence, the call she didn't deny. The warning signs I had cataloged like a librarian of disaster, and the truth was, I didn't tell him for the same reason I didn't tell anyone anything real for the past 10 years, because being honest meant blowing something up, and blowing things up meant losing people, and I was tired of being the one who made messes, even when the mess already existed. "You always get the fairy tale," I said softly, almost apologetically, and I didn't want to be the one who ruined it. He didn't say anything for a long time after that, and I didn't press him. Because beneath the anger and hurt and disbelief, I think he understood what I meant, that he had been protected his whole life in ways I never was, that the world had always bent a little softer for him, that our parents had shielded him while they handed me a toolbox and said, "Figure it out." And when someone lives that way, they don't always see the cracks until they're standing in the rubble. "I thought she was different," he said eventually, his voice thinner now. "She was," I replied. "Just not in the way you hoped." He let out a breath that sounded more like surrender than relief, and I watched as he closed his eyes and tilted his head back against the wall. "What now?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. Not one that could be said in a sentence or smoothed over with platitudes. But I knew one thing for certain, that whatever happened next, whatever Ethan chose to do with the truth Jenna had dropped at his feet and the silence I'd let fester for too long, it would change him. Maybe not loudly, maybe not dramatically, but deeply. And part of me was glad. Because for once, Ethan would have to live in the complexity I had long since learned to navigate. Before I left the treehouse, I checked my phone. A single message. From Jenna. It read, "You did what you were too scared to do. Congratulations." I stared at the screen for a long time, then turned it off, slid it into my pocket, and walked down the steps without another word. The driveway was still damp from the early evening rain, the kind that starts as a whisper and ends up drenching every well-manicured inch of suburbia, leaving behind a faint steam rising from the asphalt and the unmistakable scent of wet grass and wilted roses, a smell that, for some reason, always reminded me of endings. I saw her before she saw me, though I had no idea whether that was by accident or design, because knowing Jenna Caldwell, and at this point, I realized I probably knew her better than I had ever allowed myself to admit, there was no detail too small. No action too casual, no gesture without layers. She stood beside her car, the same gleaming white SUV she had driven to every carefully planned appearance since the moment she entered our lives, leaning against the passenger side door with her arms crossed and her chin slightly tilted. Looking not like a woman who had just dismantled an entire relationship in front of a backyard full of onlookers, but like someone calmly waiting for a delivery. I didn't rush to her, didn't speak her name, didn't approach with any of the righteous anger or sisterly protectiveness my mother might have expected from me had she seen this confrontation. I simply walked across the whetstones in my now muddied heels, clutching a cup of cold coffee I didn't even remember pouring, and came to a stop a few feet away from the woman who had somehow managed to expose every secret I had buried without ever once raising her voice. She turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable, and for a moment we just looked at each other, not with hatred, not even with resentment, but with the kind of mutual understanding that only exists between two people who have danced around each other long enough to know where all the landmines are buried. I thought I would say something first, maybe demand an explanation, maybe ask her why she chose that moment, that audience, that exact string of words to implode everything my brother thought he believed in, but it was Jenna who finally broke the silence, her voice steady and infuriatingly calm. "I didn't do it to hurt him," she said, as though that somehow made everything better, as though the wreckage she'd left behind could be swept into a neat pile and labeled something noble. "I did it because lies don't age well. And Ethan deserved to know who I really was and who you really were too." I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because of the twisted irony of it all, the idea that someone like Jenna, who had built her entire persona on control and choreography, would stand there and pretend that what she'd done was a service, a gift wrapped in truth. I didn't buy it. But I also didn't entirely blame her. Because if I had been braver, if I had spoken sooner, none of this would have fallen on her shoulders. "So that's what this was?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended, rough from too many unsaid things. Some kind of truth serum toast? Some righteous sacrifice so Ethan wouldn't end up loving the wrong version of you. She didn't flinch. He already did. There wasn't a version of me he could love without pretending, and I was tired of pretending. I looked at her then, really looked at the flawless hair now slightly frizzed from the humidity, at the high cheekbones flushed with something that wasn't embarrassment, but maybe a trace of exhaustion, at the way her hands stayed perfectly still, not fidgeting. Not nervous, just waiting. There was no pride in her eyes. No remorse either. Just that eerie, unwavering certainty that she had done what needed to be done, regardless of who got cut by the glass. He didn't deserve that, I said finally, and I believed it, even as I heard the hypocrisy in my own voice, because Ethan, for all his wide-eyed optimism and willful ignorance, had never been cruel, never manipulative, never anything other than too trusting for his own good. And maybe that was the point. Maybe people like Ethan always ended up collateral damage in the wars between the people who claimed to love them. No, Jenna agreed softly, but he needed it. Because he was living a version of life where women don't lie, and people don't leave, and family always tells you the truth. And that version? That's the real betrayal. It was a cruel logic, sharp and well-rehearsed, but it wasn't entirely wrong. Ethan had grown up in the softest corners of our family's dysfunction, shielded from the sharp edges and trained to believe in a world where everyone had his best interest at heart, and maybe that was why he never saw the cracks forming. Never saw the way Jenna watched the door more than she watched him, never saw how I winced every time she mentioned my ex by name, or rather, never mentioned him at all. Maybe the problem wasn't that he trusted too easily. Maybe it was that the rest of us had learned not to trust at all. I didn't stop you, I admitted, and that was the closest I would ever come to apologizing, both to her and to myself. I saw what was happening. I knew where it was going. I let it happen. Jenna nodded once, as if that confession wasn't just expected but necessary. Because you were tired of protecting people who wouldn't protect you, she said. And because you needed him to know that perfect stories don't end with clean hands. I wanted to argue, to say that wasn't fair, that I had always done what I thought was best for Ethan, even when it hurt, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I had kept the secret not for him, not even to protect Jenna, but to protect myself from being the one who broke the illusion. And in doing so, I handed her the burden of truth, dressed in a white dress and a smile that fooled no one. As she opened the car door, she paused and glanced back at me. "He'll be okay," she said. Not as a question, but as a certainty. He's not as fragile as he looks. He'll learn. And then she was gone, the car disappearing into the wet horizon like something from a dream you wake up from too fast, unable to remember the ending. That night, I sat across the dinner table from my mother, who had aged 10 years in 2 days, her makeup cracked at the edges, her wine glass full but untouched. The house was quiet in the way only a disappointed home can be, not grieving, not devastated, just quiet. She looked at me with eyes that no longer blamed me but didn't forgive me either, and when she finally spoke, her voice was more tired than angry. "I asked you not to ruin it." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself or explain what Jenna had done or how none of it had gone the way I planned. I simply met her gaze and said I didn't ruin it. I just let the fire start without blowing it out. She didn't speak after that. We sat in silence as the candles burned low and the air grew thick with everything we hadn't said over the last decade. And when she finally rose and left the room, I remained there alone, staring into the soft flicker of flame and wondering whether there was ever a way to tell the truth without losing someone. Do I regret what happened? Every day. And not at all. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can do isn't to protect someone, it's to step aside and let them see exactly what you saw all along. Some truths are a gift. Others are grenades. I gave my brother both. What he does with them, that's his story now.